We have spent an inordinate amount of time on the transfiguration of Jesus. It is one of those events that is extremely, extremely important that requires us to really thoroughly understand some of the issues involved and what was going on. In a sense, it sets the stage for a transitioning as we move towards the end of Jesus' ministry, the darker tones, the realization of crucifixion, so on and so forth. In this study, we're going to be looking at Matthew chapter 17, reading from the Williams translation, and just reading the one verse at verse 13. Then the disciples understood he spoke to them about John the Baptist. To me, it is fascinating that the life of John the Baptist represented an enigma to these disciples. Now, there were only 3 of the 12 present on the Mount of Transfiguration. I suspect it is probably safe to say that the issue of who and what John the Baptist was not just the domain of these 3 people. But I'm saying to you, and I'm going out on a limb and saying that the 3 are representative of what the 12 thought. In other words, I think the 12, prior to the Transfiguration, had some discussions on the nature of John the Baptist, what he was doing, and what his ministry was. And they quite possibly had some discussions on how what John was doing was related to Jesus. What the disciples were doing was an exercise in intellectual reassessment. In simple speak, we could say the disciples were being forced to think outside the box. The danger that the church faces in every age is to have its agenda set by the prevailing culture around it. Now, this is not to say that what is going on in the culture we find the church in is wrong or sinful per se. In some cases, some of the concerns are applicable to the faith in the church. What we are talking here is the danger of allowing the concerns and issues of the greater culture to be the means by which we judge what we do. If you are born in a particular culture, you will see the world through that culture. You will make reality fit that culture. And that way we are all therefore blind to what is wrong and sinful in our culture. We cannot help but see the world through the lens of our culture. We will make reality fit that culture. This is why it becomes so dangerous in the church to allow the prevailing culture to dictate what we do. We are blind to the shortcomings of our culture. This is the way we see the world. We are allowing their values and their concerns to take precedent over biblical values and concerns. The disciples in the issue of John the Baptist versus Elijah the prophet were in the process of intellectually reevaluating their culture. They had been trying to make Jesus fit into what their culture said the Messiah was to be like. They had been unable to see that in John the Baptist, the great prophecy of Elijah as the heralder of the messianic age had been fulfilled. You see, their woodenness of interpretation of Scripture, which said it had to be Elijah the prophet, made them unable to see that John the Baptist was Elijah the prophet. They had become blind to what God had done. You see, the problem was not what had happened, but that their thinking had made them unable to see what God was doing in their midst. Jesus, in modern parlance, came to rip up the old rule book. If we want to see the church rejuvenated, we have to start with the importance of Scripture in the life of the church and of daily faith. This is definitely not the same thing as taking ideas and values from the prevailing culture and finding Scripture verses to justify these things. Unfortunately, the church is guilty, whether it's leadership, family values, so on and so forth, of finding things that our culture does and then finding Scripture verses to justify why we in the church do it. And issues as diverse as the nature of ministry, the roles within marriage and family, the pursuit of success, the work of the church, and so often we can find very shallow and superficial biblical understanding of what these things are to be like. We must not allow our culture to dictate our values and our beliefs in the church. And too much of what is happening in the North America evangelical movement, our culture is shaping what we believe and what we practice. We need to rediscover what it means to think as Christians. Those free disciples, as they came down the mountain, were being forced to think in ways that their culture did not. And it was not an easy thing.